Well, what is moral imagination? Moral imagination is a key term that's elucidated by renowned business ethicist Patricia Werhane in Moral Imagination and Management Decision Making and elsewhere in some of her other articles. Moral imagination points to an individual agent's ability to be cognizant of the complex web of moral relationships that are present in any given situation and to step back from the entrenched ways of thinking that belong to one's role responsibilities in an organization or firm. We do this so as to be in a position that allows one to consider creative alternative possibilities for action. To be morally imaginative, sometimes we need to step back from the dominant interpretive models, the typical ways of looking at a problem in the business context, for example, always focusing on doing what maximizes the bottom line in the short term, or being fixated on the stock price of the company to the neglect of life itself. Sometimes we need to step back from the culture of the institution or organization in which we work. For example, the established thinking pattern and ethos that pervades the organization and links each employee to the others. Sometimes we need to step back from the set of habits that belong to one's role responsibilities in the firm, the entrenched ways of behaving that pertain to our organizational role in the firm. Sometimes we need to step back from the organizational script of the company. For example, the overriding institutional narrative, playbook, program, or set of norms that determine how the firm or corporation is supposed to operate. Sometimes we need to step back from the particular perspective, the perspective that we get locked into as somebody in the role that we're supposed to perform. Sometimes we need to step back from the perceived expectations or projections of what our bosses and peers want from us. As you've read, Werhane employs the example of the actions taken by the director of Malden Mills in order to express the meaning of this term, moral imagination. Aaron Feuerstein employed the principle that financial decision-making is not divorceable from moral decision-making. Instead of making the typical decision to lay off workers, to close down the factory, and move operations overseas, as may typically be done by firms in a situation of insolvency, Feuerstein turned to the union, his managers, engineers, and employees, whom he considered to be his biggest asset rather than an expense, and he invested millions of dollars in the development of new fabrics, for example, Polartec and Polar Fleece, which led the company to once again become profitable. In the article, Werhane differentiates and contrasts Feuerstein's actions from those in other firms experiencing problems like fiscal insolvency, where the actors involved fixated only on the immediacy of the bottom line. This narrow focus led General Electric, Kidder, Peabody and Company, Equity Funding, and Ford to simply keep their corporate programs going on by perpetuating frauds of various sorts. Werhane thinks that the difference between Malden Mills and General Electric is moral imagination in managerial and corporate decision-making. Instead of merely closing the factory down, Feuerstein revitalized and doubled down on the relationships over which he presided in order to bring the company back into profitability. To boil what Werhane means by moral imagination down to its lowest common denominator, and here we're really doing violence to the term, we could say that it simply means thinking outside the box. We've all heard this cliche. And usually by it we mean something like being able to come up with creative solutions to a problem or a moral issue that confronts us. It's kind of a popular saying or a cliche, but what really do we mean by thinking outside the box, and how can we cultivate this kind of ability? Usually to these kinds of questions, people don't have an adequate response. Werhane's concept goes a long way to help us understand this cliche or saying, that we need to get outside of what's expected on the basis of our role in terms of our thinking in order to find novel solutions to problems, creatively coming up with alternative possibilities for action in respect to the moral problems that we're encountering. But there's more to the term than just that, and she takes the whole book really to cash out its full meaning. For our purposes in this course, it not only means thinking outside the box in respect to morally problematic situations and moral issues, but having a moral imagination points to the strength of our own internal moral compass, namely our ability to recognize that a situation in which we find ourselves poses a moral problem to begin with. Most people probably don't reach that point in many instances in which they should contemplate what the right best course of action is to take. The saying, thinking outside the box, also doesn't represent the connection that Werhane implies between moral imagination and critical moral deliberation, a term that we'll get to in the next lecture. And the need for not only creativity in our thinking, but also for using the tools of critical reasoning in order to find out what the right best thing for us to do is. Whereas creativity without critical thinking is perhaps blind, critical thinking without creativity is lame. The point Werhane is trying to make is that these two aptitudes, moral imagination and critical moral deliberation, are to be merged in respect to business decision-making. Moral imagination for her is a necessary condition for critical moral deliberation, whereas critical moral deliberation is a sufficient condition for moral imagination. This is to say that finding out what the right best thing to do is in any given situation largely depends on imagination. But imagination is not sufficient for our doing of the right best thing. It doesn't guarantee that we do the right best thing. We could be very imaginative in coming up with a creative strategy that would see us perpetuate a massive fraud in order to corner an entire market, but of course this doesn't take into account the moral dimension of moral deliberation. So while we need to be able to consider to generate creative alternative possibilities for action from which we can select from, we also need rational deliberation, argumentation, and consultation of the moral theories, for example, from the history of philosophy, in order to weigh these options so as to be sure that we're doing the right thing. This is what Werhane means in total by moral imagination, the merger of imagination and creativity with critical rational moral deliberation. Two other examples of such imagination from outside the business context come to us from an author by the name of John Eisenberg, who's a meta-ethicist, and he's writing in a book called The Limits of Reason, Indeterminacy in Law, Education, and Morality. I'm just going to read you one of his examples, and it's a little bit amusing. He writes, in 1847, the Crystal Palace was completed in London. This magnificent glass structure was seen by Queen Victoria as a major achievement of her reign, the dearest jewel in her crown. Unfortunately, events did not turn out as she planned. Rather than bringing forth crowds of overawed visitors from Britain and abroad enjoying its exhibitions and performances, the Crystal Palace was virtually deserted. It seems that the warmth and light created by the glass structure attracted thousands upon thousands of sparrows. The noise and the dirt resulting from this massive invasion of birds discouraged many of the would-be visitors who disliked the noise created by the sparrows and shunned having their top hats and bonnets soiled by these intruders. The Queen was generally distressed by the turn of events. She sought counsel from architects, builders, planners, and advisors. One suggestion was using buckshot to chase off the birds. But this was unacceptable because it would not have a massive effect on the birds and it would seriously damage the glass structure. A second suggestion was to place chemical drums that exploded at regular intervals in places where the sparrows congregated. However, this too was unacceptable because the noise that would temporarily drive away the sparrows would irritate the visitors to the building. Poisoning was also suggested and rejected because of the mess of corpses that it would create. Finally, near despair, Queen Victoria summoned the aged Duke of Wellington for advice. After she recounted the problem to her great general and national hero, Wellington paused, then uttered in a crackling voice, "Sparrowhawks!" And this solved the problem, till the structure was destroyed years later. In this case, there was a need for a creative, morally imaginative solution, which solved the problems of the sparrows at the same time as not damaging the Crystal Palace, as well as preserving it as a national symbol representing the greatness of the British Empire that everyone could enjoy visiting. Wellington's suggestion of bringing sparrowhawks to the Crystal Palace, an enemy of one's enemy, sparrows, provided this solution. So that, the creative solution, sparrowhawks, could, while this case study kind of doesn't deal particularly with the moral issue, it doesn't indicate to us the type of creativity that we would desire if we were to be morally imaginative. It represents imagination, this kind of creative imagination that we're talking about. Another example comes also from the same book by John Eisenberg. And he writes, students of a 6th grade class are presented with a dilemma. The students have been given a homework assignment in a science course that involved using a lighted candle. Their assignment was due the next day. When they arrived home, they found a note from their parents stating that they would be home late after their bedtime. In the note, the students were told to do their homework and not to stay up late. The students also know that they are not supposed to light matches or start a fire in the house if no adults are home. So we might ask, what should the students do? Well, some students attempted to do the experiment carefully and later explained to their parents how important it was. Others believed that obeying their parents' rule was more important, and so they didn't do the experiment. However, one student, in a truly creative problem-solving fashion, did the experiment outside the house. And this student could be viewed as exhibiting moral imagination, or at least imagination, merging the need to do the homework and at the same time obeying rules at home. The imaginative student created a new context in which none of the values would be in play would be undermined. By going outside, the student could complete the assignment without violating an important rule. Undoubtedly, one could argue that going outside would also create a danger for the child, and safety is a crucial value. On a substantive level, this criticism is correct. However, it does take a considerable imagination, as the student displayed, to create a situation that would resolve the problem. So in this respect, we might ask whether it's right for a child to start fires in general. As such, the imagination is not itself sufficient for doing the right best thing. It requires the moral aspect, as in critical moral deliberation. So imagination, if it's merged together with the skills that we're going to learn that we are going to call critical moral deliberation, sort of the ideal for this class, well, that's the key to solving moral issues. Another case study comes to us from my medical ethics class, and this example is given in a book called Ethics for the Professions, and it goes as follows. Mary knew why her best friend Sarah was calling. She knew Sarah's overall condition had continued to deteriorate as a result of inoperable cancer. Now, Sarah said, she was ready to die on her own terms, in her own way, and not on the terms set by an awful disease which, as she put it, is robbing me of my dignity. Mary, a nurse, had agreed 2 months ago to actively help her friend in ending her life, something that is legally impermissible in Canada. Mary was still worried because she wasn't as knowledgeable as a doctor, and she feared making a mistake with the dosage of the drug that would end her life, leaving her friend in a vegetative state rather than putting her out of her misery. Sarah, however, had refused to consult with the doctor, saying that dying was just too personal to involve anybody who wasn't a close friend. So she wanted Mary to do it, and Mary again had promised that she would help her out. So what should Mary do? Well, in these kinds of cases, most people recognize the conflicting values that are in play. Most people recognize the dire stakes for oneself and or for Mary that are involved if one carries out the procedure. But at the same time, one could lose one's job and reputation, or put Mary in a vegetative state should something go wrong. At the same time, there's a need to be loyal to Mary as a close friend. And as such, we remain internally conflicted if we merely end there and decide between the two problematic alternatives for action. Here we've got to step back from this internal conflict and do something outside of the two options. The most creative or morally imaginative answer, perhaps, is something along the following lines. Take Mary offshore to Switzerland, where euthanasia is legal, to have the procedure and to have a final adventure together. The two friends could have this kind of final goodbye adventure together. That would be an example of an imaginative solution to this problem. Of course, it begs the question whether or not euthanasia in general is morally acceptable. So again, the imagination is not it's not a guarantee of doing the right best thing. It's something else that we need to consider. A fourth example stems right out of the previous example, and it involves a case study that I gave on my final exam of my medical ethics course last year. It also involves euthanasia. It involves dealing with a patient in a terminal condition who's in tremendous pain and calls on you as a doctor to help end her suffering, even though active euthanasia is illegal in Canada. Also, making any sort of consultation or advising any person on whether or not they should end their lives, that's also illegal in Canada. So the doctor would be doing something illegal if they even advise the patient to do that. You'd be putting your career in jeopardy by helping or even counseling your patient in relation to committing suicide. So in this case, I won't read it totally, you're sort of conflicted between being compassionate to your patient who's requesting an end to their lives, for your help in ending their lives, at the same time recognizing that you could lose your job and your reputation and your career, and you'd be doing something illegal. So you might say, "Oh, well, let's take her to Switzerland," or something like that. Well, again, or talk about taking her to Switzerland, or talk about her going to Switzerland, or something like that. Again, you'd be doing something illegal, because it's illegal to counsel a person to commit suicide or encourage a person to commit suicide in Canada. So putting oneself into the role of the doctor, one's got to find a solution in which one is compassionate to one's dying patient, as well as upholding the criminal code. Some of the most creative answers that were waged on the test, or used in their answers, the most morally imaginative answers, involve simply dropping a copy of a newspaper on the patient's lap. The paper containing the highly publicized 2013 story of Susan Griffiths, who was an individual who wished to die. She was in a terminally ill state and who wished to die, and she actually did go to Switzerland for the procedure. So there you wouldn't be counseling your patient in relation to euthanasia. You wouldn't be doing anything of the sort. However, again, if we carried out this kind of act, the imagination and creativity here isn't sufficient for doing the right best thing. We still need to contemplate whether or not euthanasia is truly moral by engaging in critical moral deliberation and applying the moral theories in doing so. As such, according to Werhane, being morally imaginative, in which we're able to reframe a problematic situation in our mind and to view it from multiple perspectives in order to be able to generate novel possibilities for action, is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for critical moral deliberation. We'll be taking up this term critical moral deliberation, which is again the ideal for this class, in the next lecture.